In this episode, we react to the recent Supreme Court decision, which essentially places U.S. presidents above the law. We also look at criticism from the McKinsey study in 2015, which showed an association between companies with diverse leadership and profits. And also the concern that some experts are expressing over falling birth rates around the world. Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and riding shotgun with me today is a man who could be considered the hardest working man in podcasting, Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, are you ready to show the people how you got that new bag?
Yeah, but if I'm the hardest working guy, then the whole industry is in trouble. So I think Mr. Beast or some of these other guys out there might be a little bit harder.
They're doing a little more than you, putting a little more into it.
Yeah. Or I'm just extremely underpaid for the amount of work I'm doing. One or the other. So we'll see. We'll see if we solve that one ever.
Yeah. That's just another one of those things. We'll have to take a look at it at another time. So
maybe I'll get the Supreme Court to look into it. What about
some people can get the Supreme Court to jump in when needed. So maybe you can. But now before we get started, if you enjoy the show, I ask that you subscribe or like on YouTube or your podcast app. Doing so really helps the show out. Recording this on July 2nd, 2024. And today, yesterday, we saw the U.S. Supreme Court rule that U.S. presidents, in many respects, are above the law. Now, specifically, they say presidents are not subject to the law when performing, quote unquote, official acts, which is the duties enumerated under the Constitution, the things that it says the executive branch president does. So they are immune from prosecution for doing any of that stuff, regardless of their purpose for doing that stuff. And then also that there's a strong presumption of immunity if they're doing anything that's even related to that stuff or touches that stuff in any way. So it's about as broad as you can imagine, functionally, without just saying that they're immune to anything. So all of this is in the backdrop of former President Trump's ongoing criminal prosecutions. And while, Trump is the first president to face prosecution, and so this stuff relates directly to, and the case that was decided was a case that he brought. It relates to, a filing that he made, a case brought against him, in the filing he made. But the implications are much broader than that. This pretty much can apply to any president now or in the future who wants to exercise power as a king. It lays out the roadmap for that. So, Tunde, just to get us started, what is your reaction to this Supreme Court ruling and, kind of this new age and this new era of the American experiment that we've entered, where now we have leadership that is above the law?
Yeah, I mean, initially it was a little bit of shock, but then when I start thinking about it, I'm not that shocked. This court appears to definitely have an ideological bend and to not be ashamed to flex kind of that muscle, so to speak. And we'll get into, and I'll explain why I specifically said that. But just, to answer again, just my reaction is just interesting, man. Here we are the week of July 4th, celebrating the Declaration of Independence. And for people that are watching YouTube, you can see I'm wearing my London, England shirt in celebration of the fact we left King George. But like you said, this is definitely the potential for a game changer in the way that the United States conducts itself as a nation. This is the first time that, the court has ruled in writing that a president is no longer held to the same standard as other citizens in certain respects, and that in his office as president, he is immune from the law. Now, that I guess we'll have to wait and see how presidents use that power. But, the reason why I believe the founders of this country tried to diffuse power by having three separate but co-equal branches of government was specifically to avoid what the colonists rose up against and had a whole war and created a nation to separate themselves from a king. Yeah. So, that's my opinion, but the Constitution
that's not just your opinion, though. They broke that stuff down.
The Constitution of the United States and their writings, have backed that up.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a different United States over time. maybe not by tomorrow, but
Yeah. I mean, I think these are the types of things you see that lay the groundwork for the nation to become a different nation. I mean, there haven't been any shortage of people who aspired for king-like powers, but up until now, the system, the constraints that are placed on the Constitution, and like you said, the three co-equal branches of government and so forth have constrained. I mean, Nixon, under this logic here, Nixon could have very easily not faced any threat at all, would not have had to resign or anything like that, because he would have been able to say this was an official act, essentially by ordering an official act. The president is the commander in chief. So by ordering the military to do things, or ordering, the lead is also the head of the Department of Justice. So, head law enforcement officer. So by ordering the FBI to do things, like, the president can do things now, and it's part of his official act, depending on who he tells to do it. And all of that stuff is clear. All of that stuff can be, regardless of the purpose of it or anything. It doesn't have to be for some governmental purpose or anything like that. And there are sprinkled in types of immunity that certain government officials have. You can't be sued for defamation. For legislatures, can't be sued for defamation for things they say as part of when they're debating and so forth. Prosecutors have a certain level of immunity in terms of how they bring charges, but none of this stuff is blanket, in the sense that, because the nature of the office of the president allows them, if they're the executive, the chief executive allows them to do so many things, to execute vision and to execute what we're trying to accomplish. Giving this person absolute immunity, or this level of immunity, it's particularly a risk. And this is one that, again, what the founding fathers were very clear that they were trying to avoid. So I think we have to be honest with ourselves, that we're going into something different now. This is not the nation that the founding fathers set up anymore, period. We Americans do like to think of themselves, and have always had a different view of who they are versus how their country actually runs. Like, oh, Americans, we're about, freedom, but, there's slaves there, or there's, we're about equality, but you got Jim Crow, things like that. So it's always been kind of a disconnect between the way Americans think of themselves and what their nation is about versus, what exactly was happening in practice. But right now, I think we should be very careful, especially at least people who like the idea of all men under the law and so forth like that, to be aware that that's just not where we are right now, and not every president, is going to try to exercise king-like powers, but we know some that would. And so, or some people who would, if they got into that office. So we're going into a different phase now. Ideally, the Americans would be more conscientious in vetting and in terms of who they would want to put in that office with these new powers now. That may or may not happen, but nonetheless, the office of the president now is not that person is no longer operating in the same form of kind of society as the rest of us. They are separate from us, and they can operate as a king, so should they so choose, and we need to be aware of that.
Yeah, no, and it's amazing. I mean, it's like they retroactively went back and helped a former president make sure that he either won't be prosecuted for things, crimes he committed against the United States that were crimes at the time, that he's currently being prosecuted for by the United States. And it's just, I'm just thinking of the fake elector scheme. Again, this is the benefit of propaganda. One of my thoughts in all this was that Roger Ailes, the former founder and head of Fox News, won. His goal was to make sure there was never another Watergate, and now
he
probably won't have
his takeaway from what happened with Nixon and Watergate was that, hey, we got to set up an apparatus so this never happens again. And
and basically we have now succeeded in not we like me and you, but as a nation we've succeeded in making that happen. And that point, what I'm making isn't just for the audience. Just to break down real quick, the fake elector scheme was actually a crime. This is why, I've got an issue with all media right now, because the way they talk about these things, the documents case. No, he stole classified secrets and put them in his house where he lives, and then unguarded.
And then the wouldn't give them back part is an important part.
So that's a crime, right? It's a crime to defraud the National Archives and have this whole conspiracy behind the scenes, of which people have been put in jail. Many attorneys have already lost their bar licenses around the country that participated in this. So the courts have already said this was wrong. And what the goal was to send fake electors from states in replace of the electors that represented true American voters and use that to try and usurp the election. And that was going to be Mike Pence's job to disrupt everything on January 6th. So the idea is that, yes, there were attempts to defraud the United States. And I'll say, okay, allegedly a crime was committed because the court cases haven't played out yet. But that's really what's been going on is the courts have been looking at were crimes committed in attempt to defraud the United States and defraud the legitimate voters of the United States. And the Supreme Court just put a squash on all of it and said, nope, the
at least as it relates
can do
to
whatever
the
he
one
wants.
person. Well, that's as it relates to the one person. Now, we'll see later on, it'll be, okay, yeah, the president will try, or certain presidents will try to say, well, anybody, if I order the Secretary of Defense to assassinate this person, then they are protected they have immunity because they're following my orders. Like, that'll be how this stands out further.
Yeah. So it's effectively an immunity on doing whatever.
Yes. And so, I mean, and kind of what I was saying as far as we have to be aware of the new era we've entered is that we are no longer a nation of laws. Like, we're a nation of men. The system is not the supreme thing. What is supreme is the whims of the person who is in the presidency, because that person can do whatever they want to do. And, it's what's really interesting to me is we didn't see prior to this an outpouring of people who wanted the president to have king-like powers. Like, the last time I look at I do kind of want to get into just how this Supreme Court has remade the character of the country over the last, let's say, 10, 15 years. But when the last time that happened, was the Warren Court, mid 1900s, mid 20th century, and the Warren Court remade, the country in many respects, in terms of, with what they did with the segregation and civil rights and so forth, and just rights in general, and it's recognized in history that the Warren Court, they did a lot to change the nature of the country, and we're living through a moment like that now. But when the Warren Court was doing that, this was like there were people in the streets. There was this mass outcry for a certain result. Hey, we want more equality or anything like that. Right now, it doesn't seem like there's people in the street that are saying, hey, we got to have presidents that are immune to office. Or looking back further with Citizens United, we got to have corporations that can spend as much money on elections as they possibly want, and things like that. Like, where the impetus for these types of rulings are coming from seem to be coming from some place that we're just not seeing. Like, there's clearly an impetus. There's clearly an effort to put all this stuff in place, but it's not coming from the masses. There seems to be coming from special interests and interest groups that are saying, hey, we want to advance a certain worldview or a certain view of how the nation should be, and with everybody else looking at other stuff, we're just going to get to work and do all this stuff and really fundamentally change the character of the nation. And so, like, what are your thoughts? Just kind of, and again, we're not going to get into all the individual decisions because there's been a lot, but just on the way over the last, the last 10, 15 years, I really, you could point to Citizens United as kind of where this thing really started to fundamentally change, because that was a decision that said, yes, organizations, entities have equal free speech rights to actual human beings. And then, which again is a fundamental shift in the way we look at things. And just the nature of how not necessarily, you could talk about the disconnect if you want, but just the nature of how this court has remade the American experiment, and has done so like kind of if you're not following this stuff, you're not even seeing, like, there's not some mass outcry that they're doing this in response to. It seems like they have a plan and they're operating this plan, and the rest of us are kind of looking the other way.
I'll start where you ended. Yes, the rest of us are looking the other way. And this reminds me of that whole Star Wars thing of, democracy dying to applause, and the ability of, this is like let me back it up here because I got a lot going on in my head. It's interesting, the level of projection by some. And then so I'm thinking of things like the concept of a deep state, right?
Yeah.
We have a large country with 330 whatever million people, and it's a very complex, right? There's a lot going on here, a lot of from cars on the road that and those rules and laws to manufacturing and all kind of stuff. So is there a big bureaucracy and an administrative state that exists in the American government? Yes, of course. There's always been, because as the country grew, you need a bigger apparatus to deal with a bigger country and more stuff, right? You're a patent attorney, and I remember you telling me from the time you got out of law school to now, just the amount of patents that have been issued because people keep inventing stuff. And those new things need to be regulated and somebody needs to decide how they interact with the public and all that. So that is just a fact. What you're talking about is an actual deep state that some people project onto others in our country, but there is really, it seems, a cabal of a small group of very wealthy people who want to influence government in a way that is outside the norms.
It's opaque. It's like, hey, let's buy Supreme Court justices.
Well, what I'm saying is it's outside the norms of the democratic process of politics, right? This is to step around the voters, right? Because to your point, the public wanted things, let's say back in the civil rights era, like integration generally. And there was a lot of public that didn't. But we saw both sides because both sides would be in the street arguing about it and protests and counter protests and all that. And we got to see
who the sides were and who was on what side and, arguing, like we got to work the issue out in public, which is distinct from what, I want to throw in a couple things and then I'll kick it back to you, but just which is distinct from now. We don't really get to see, it's kind of opaque. We don't get to see who the sides are here and who is arguing for what. It's kind of like there is a group of people saying they're going to kind of maintain the status quo. There's radical people who are out here saying, hey, we're going to change this or change that. We can see it with abortion, for example. In contrast, with abortion, there are people saying, hey, we're trying to get rid of this. And there's people saying, hey, we're trying to keep it. And so we can see those fights and then they can have it out and so forth. But in terms of the power grabs, in terms of, presidential immunity or corporations, so another recent ruling, overturning the Chevron precedent, which was just last week, where it's like gutting administrative agencies' ability to regulate companies. And so it's like giving more power to large corporations and so forth. And
what it is
let me just for the deep state thing, what we hoped and what I thought the deep state would be was the allegiance to the Constitution that everyone in the government should have. And so, yes, if you get in the government and you are trying to do things that are contrary to the Constitution, I hope there would be pushback against that from within the government, because those people aren't supposed to be loyal to the person at the head of the government or the person at the head of their department. They're supposed to be loyal to the Constitution. But what you're pointing out, and what is apparent at this point, that there's also a deep state operating that they're not loyal to the Constitution as it is. They are trying to change the country in a way that they see would benefit themselves or that they like. And they're doing so outside the bounds of ways that we can see, we can hear, we can evaluate, and we can decide with our voting, here's how we want to do stuff. And to your point on the projection, that's what people are calling the people who are loyal to the Constitution. They're trying to frame them as people in that kind of sense. And so it's notable. The projection is notable from that standpoint. I think it's a good point you made.
Yeah. And really what it is, because, you mentioned the Chevron case, and I think this is part of the problem, which is not fixable, which is these guys have been doing a lot of work, and it's like that fire hose. Everyone's got to drink out of this fire hose of information. And, it's most of us Americans, number one, we're not attorneys, are trained in all this, legal briefs and stuff like that. The second thing is, it's a lot of stuff. So example, again, for the audience, the Chevron case was I guess, decided last week.
Well, the case that overturned the Chevron case. The Chevron case was and this is something I learned in law school. Like it's legal precedent that allowed administrative agencies to actually enforce regulations, and you don't have to take them to court and all this other stuff. But within the actual administrative agency, you have regulations. You can say, okay, you guys violated this. Here, we're going to assess this fine. And so forth. And so it streamlined the ability. Hey, you're dumping poison into the lake, or hey, you said that this is in your product, but it's not in your product, or whatever. You say that lead isn't there, and in fact we're testing and lead is there. And so you do things that are inconsistent with the law or regulations in some way, and then we, as an administrative agency, without going to court and everything like that, we can hold you accountable for that. And so that's been legal precedent for a while now. And that got overturned the last week.
Yeah, well, and I think you made an important statement right there, which is the holding to account, being held accountable. And I think what we're really seeing is, and this is where I want to just go down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, which is you really go 30,000 feet, what we're seeing is the dismantling of the ability to hold small groups of powerful interests accountable. And we just learned that the president of the United States will no longer be held to account while he's in his official position like the rest of us would be. And we've also learned, like you said, that certain, large corporations or corporations just that are well-heeled and doing certain things will not be held accountable by federal agencies. And I think the one of the things I've seen, so for example, we have the recent ruling on bump stocks, which makes a semi-automatic into basically an automatic weapon where it can fire 400 to 800 rounds per minute.
Yeah. What did Clarence Thomas say? It gives the shooter a lightning fast trigger finger. Like, like that. I can't believe you said that out loud.
But the bottom line is, again, these guys, what they're doing is really gaslighting the country and gaslighting the founding fathers and the spirit of the United States with all of this stuff. That's why I kind of, it's a lot to cover. That's what I mean. It's hard for people the average person to keep up with all this stuff. But if you think about it, the idea of saying, automatic weapons should not be legal in the hands of civilians for obvious reasons, that not every civilian is responsible with regular semi-automatic or single shot weapons. Imagine how much of a disaster if everyone had an automatic rifle. But in one context, the Supreme Court will be constitutionalist saying, oh, well, the Second Amendment doesn't say anything specifically about the types of weapons and all this. Okay. Yeah. And then they also, what happens is by gutting the federal agency's ability to deal with this, and I know there's no equivalence for this necessarily on guns, but let's just say, like you said, about the EPA or one of these organizations or the FDA ruling about something that they're putting in food, a big corporation putting in food. What happens is the judges themselves now have said, no, we're going to be the subject matter experts.
Yeah.
So me as a Supreme Court justice, I'm going to explain to you how a gun is, the mechanics of a gun and a rifle, and I'm going to explain to you why a bump stock is this or that, instead of going to actual firearm experts. And this is what's going to happen over time with these kind of rulings, which is the judges themselves are going to begin to make decisions based on when a scientist in the FDA says, hey, if we put that into food, it's going to hurt people. Instead of having the FDA just make that decision based on scientific fact, and maybe the corporation can sue the FDA. And they can take it on appeals and all that, and everybody. Well,
and that drags it out. That makes it much more expensive and so forth. And the goal would be deterrence at that point, and saying, okay, well, they're not going to try to regulate as much because it's like, well, it's going to be so expensive. And then, like you said, they're going to be like, hey, the tobacco industry for decades was able to muddy the science on whether cigarettes were bad for you.
Yeah,
fossil fuel industry
climate
for
change,
decades
stuff with Exxon.
And these are issues that. So when you get to that, the debate of the scientists can be bought. And so
let me finish where I'm going with this arc here, because I'm almost done. Which is basically what has happened is the manipulation of the Supreme Court over time with things like Citizens United, allowing so much money to go and dark money to go into politics that's untraceable. These guys have won now. This is the true, again, the projection of people like George Soros, who might fund some liberal causes, dwarfs the reality of the Harlan Crows, the Leonard Leos, the Koch brothers, who spend billions of dollars in recent decades to make sure this happens. And so what's going to happen is, this is why there's been such a big deal in the last decade about packing the federal courts by conservatives and people on the right, because now you're going to have judges from an ideological perspective, when these cases get brought in front of them, will just make decisions based on what they believe, just like we saw what happened with the Constitution.
Decisions become about ideology and not necessarily an understanding of the facts. Because again, how much can you become an expert on the facts in over the course of a 2-week trial? And so you're just going to kind of pick a side and say, okay, well, I like the side, and that's I think the inconsistency. The inconsistency that you point out is kind of on point as well, because and on one hand we're seeing, okay, the Supreme Court it's textualist, it's originalist, but nothing in this decision right here is textualist, or
there's nothing in the Constitution that said the president's immune.
It can't be prosecuted for committing crimes, and so it's we're seeing that now. Like at some point, maybe there was some level of ideological consistency, but at this point, we've entered a point where the ends they're working towards the ends, and whatever logic they need to get there, they're using that to get there. And that's, for me as a lawyer, that bothers. Obviously, the public's not going to get too fired up about that. But what we're seeing, though, again, and we have to understand that it's not like, this is where America becomes the different kind of a country. America has been considered, and considers themselves, Americans often consider themselves, as it's an exceptional, American exceptionalism and so forth. And if you look at the root of that word, an exception, you do things differently than other nations do. What made America exceptional for all of this time was the supremacy of the law, the fact that we're having a document govern what's happening. We've left that, basically. And so if we're looking at a Supreme Court that has gone and basically said, okay, this is how we want the world to be, regardless of the logic we need to get there. It's not much different, other than the kind of the ends, as what the Warren Court did in terms of, when in terms of integration, civil rights, and all that. But it hasn't that they've won. Basically, we are at a different point now where hopefully this motivates people to look more at the character of the leadership that they're putting in power, because that's going to become more and more important. The goal has been lately to kind of, hey, let's look at all the issues and just vote for the people that are saying the things that you like. But we're really going to have to look at character more, because in the setup that we have now, the character of the people who are making the decisions, who are putting judges in, and the character of the judges they're putting in is going to matter more and more, because the laws, the Constitution, is becoming less and less of a constraint on the behavior of our elected officials. And so, again, I hope that Americans can respond to this, because it's still a government of the people. But, you get a say every couple of years, or every 4 years, or every 6 years, depending on the office. But once you have that say, then you're going to live with the character of that person forever, whatever period of that time. So I think that's going to be the biggest takeaway that thoughtful Americans are going to have, is that you're going to have to, the character of the person is going to matter moving forward a lot. And, the individual kind of, like the individual battles here and there, like, oh yeah, you might be a one issue voter and you vote for this, but if you put in somebody whose character say, hey, I'm never going to leave office, or hey, I want to be able to shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, then we're going to have to live with a lot more other stuff just because you wanted that one little issue.
Yeah.
So, but no, I think we can close this up from there. I mean, this is something that we can go on forever on, but I just did, like, looking at this in a way on how what the responsibility it puts back on the voters, I think is important as well. Because we're looking at it's like, oh man, that's crazy, I can't believe they did that. But at the same time, like, the voters will have a say, periodically, and so there's going to be more responsibility on the voters, because the Constitution is going to be less there. There has been less there to help us in the past and moving forward. So, but we can, we'll wrap this section up. Please join us on part 2 and part 3 of this show as well. And we appreciate you for joining us on this.